The handcuffs clicked around his wrists as tears streamed down his face. Just minutes earlier, this man had been screaming at me about fake violations and threatening to have me arrested. Now he was the one being arrested, sobbing like a child in front of the entire neighborhood he had terrorized for months. My sister stood beside me, her real police badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. She looked nothing like the fake security officer who was now being loaded into the back of a patrol car. The crowd of neighbors pressed closer, their phones recording every second of his humiliation. For months, this imposter had made our lives hell with his fake authority and made-up rules. He picked on elderly residents, single mothers, anyone who seemed vulnerable. He thought he was untouchable, protected by his fake uniform and his fake patrol car. But today, his reign of terror ended, and it all started when he made one fatal mistake. He blocked my driveway while my sister was visiting. My name is David, and I have always been the type of person who just wants to live quietly. I work from home, I keep my lawn neat, and I mind my own business. My house sits on a quiet street in what used to be a peaceful suburban neighborhood. I say used to be because for the past 6 months, our community had been living under the thumb of someone who was about to get exactly what he deserved. It was a Saturday morning in early October when my sister Rachel came to visit for the weekend. Rachel is a police officer in the county next to ours, and she has been in law enforcement for over 10 years. She knows real authority when she sees it, and she definitely knows fake authority when she sees it too. That morning, as we sat on my front porch drinking coffee, I told her about the man who had been making everyone's life miserable. His name was Gary, and he claimed to be some kind of HOA security officer. He drove around in a white car with flashing lights, wore what looked like a police uniform, and carried a clipboard full of citations that he would hand out to anyone who dared to question him. Gary had been terrorizing our neighborhood for months. He would show up at people's doors with his fake authority, claiming they had violated some rule or regulation. He targeted the elderly residents first, like Mrs. Henderson, who lived 3 houses down. She was 78 years old and lived alone, and Gary had convinced her that she owed hundreds of dollars in fines for having her trash cans out too early. Then there was Maria, a single mother of 2 who worked double shifts just to make ends meet. Gary had issued her multiple citations for having toys in her front yard and for parking her car in what he claimed was the wrong spot in her own driveway. Maria was terrified that she might lose her home if she did not pay his bogus fines. The worst part was that Gary seemed to enjoy the power he had over people. He would stand at their front doors, clipboard in hand, speaking in an official tone that made people believe they had no choice but to comply. His uniform looked real enough, and his car had those flashing lights that made everyone think he was legitimate law enforcement. I had been watching this happen for months, getting angrier and angrier each time I saw him pull up to another neighbor's house. But I had never been directly confronted by him until that Saturday afternoon when Rachel was visiting. Rachel listened to my story with growing concern. As a real police officer, she knew immediately that something was not right about this situation. She asked me questions about Gary's uniform, his vehicle, and the citations he was issuing. With each answer I gave, her frown deepened. "David," she said, setting down her coffee cup, "what you are describing sounds like someone impersonating a police officer. That is a serious felony. Are you absolutely sure this man has the authority he claims to have?" I told her that none of us had ever thought to question his authority. He looked official, he acted official, and he spoke with the confidence of someone who knew the law. But now that Rachel was asking these questions, I realized that I had never actually seen any legitimate credentials from Gary. "Has anyone ever called the police about this?" Rachel asked. I shook my head. Everyone is too scared. They think he really is some kind of law enforcement officer. They are afraid that if they complain, he will make their lives even worse. Rachel stood up from her chair and walked to the edge of the porch. She looked down the street with the trained eye of someone who had spent years dealing with criminals and con artists. "David, I think your neighborhood is being scammed by someone who is pretending to be a police officer. And if I am right, he is about to face some very serious consequences." Little did we know that Gary was about to give us the perfect opportunity to expose him for exactly what he was. We did not have to wait long. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, I heard the familiar sound of Gary's fake patrol car pulling up outside my house. I looked out the window and saw him parking his white car directly behind my driveway, completely blocking my ability to get in or out. This was typical Gary behavior. He would block driveways, park in front of fire hydrants, and take up multiple parking spaces, all while claiming he was conducting official business. But today was different. Today, Rachel was here to witness his act firsthand. I watched as Gary got out of his car and adjusted his fake uniform. He was a short, pudgy man in his 50s with thinning hair and a permanent scowl on his face. He wore what looked like a police uniform, complete with a badge and a utility belt, but something about it always seemed off to me. Now that Rachel had pointed out the signs of impersonation, I could see that his uniform was not quite right. The colors were slightly wrong, the badge looked cheap, and his patches did not match any legitimate law enforcement agency. Gary walked up to my front door with his usual arrogant swagger, clipboard in hand. I could see that he already had a citation filled out before he even knocked on my door. This was another one of his tactics. He would write up violations before he even spoke to people, making them feel like they were already guilty of something. I opened the door before he could knock. "Gary, you are blocking my driveway. I need you to move your car." He looked at me with that condescending smile that I had seen him use on so many of my neighbors. "Mr. Thompson, I am conducting official business. I have received multiple complaints about violations on your property." "What violations?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm even though my blood was starting to boil. Gary consulted his clipboard with exaggerated importance. "Your hedges are 3 inches too high according to HOA regulations. Your mailbox is painted the wrong color, and you have been parking in an unauthorized manner." Every single thing he had just said was completely made up. My hedges were perfectly trimmed. My mailbox was the same color it had been for 5 years, and I had been parking in the same spot in my own driveway since I moved in. But Gary said these things with such authority that I could see how other residents had been intimidated into believing him. "I want to see some identification," I said. "I want to see your badge and your credentials." Gary's face flushed red. This was clearly not the response he was used to getting from residents. "You do not get to demand anything from me. I am a law enforcement officer conducting official business. If you continue to obstruct my investigation, I will have you arrested." That was when Rachel appeared in the doorway behind me. She was not in uniform since she was visiting on her day off, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who really did have authority. Gary looked at her with suspicion, but continued with his act. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to step back inside while I conduct official business with Mr. Thompson." Rachel smiled politely. "Actually, I think I will stay right here. I am very interested in learning more about your official business." Gary did not like being questioned, especially by a woman. His voice got louder and more aggressive. I do not know who you think you are, but I am a certified law enforcement officer. I have the authority to issue citations, conduct investigations, and make arrests. If you interfere with my duties, you will be arrested too." By this time, neighbors were starting to come out of their houses to see what was happening. Mrs. Henderson was peeking out from behind her curtains. Maria was standing on her front porch with her two children beside her. Other residents were gathering on the sidewalk, some of them holding their phones to record what was happening. Rachel stepped forward slightly. "Officer, I would like to see your badge and your identification. I would also like to know what agency you work for and what jurisdiction you have in this neighborhood." Gary's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "I do not have to show you anything. I am conducting official business, and I will not be questioned by civilians." That was when I knew Rachel had him. Real police officers do not refuse to show their credentials when asked. Real police officers do not get defensive when questioned about their authority. And real police officers certainly do not threaten to arrest people for asking legitimate questions. The crowd of neighbors was growing larger. Some of them were the same people that Gary had been terrorizing for months. They were watching this confrontation with a mixture of fear and hope. Fear because they were still intimidated by Gary's fake authority, but hope because for the first time, someone was standing up to him. Gary seemed to realize that he was losing control of the situation. He waved his clipboard in the air and raised his voice even louder. "All of you need to disperse immediately. This is official police business. Anyone who does not leave will be arrested for obstruction of justice." But nobody moved. For the first time in months, the people of our neighborhood were not running away from Gary's threats. They were standing their ground and watching as his fake authority began to crumble. Rachel remained perfectly calm despite Gary's increasingly aggressive behavior. She had dealt with all kinds of criminals and con artists in her career, and she knew exactly how to handle someone like Gary. She stepped forward with the quiet confidence of someone who really did have authority. "Officer, I am going to ask you one more time to show me your badge and your identification. I would also like to see your patrol car registration and any documentation that proves you have jurisdiction in this neighborhood." Gary's hands were shaking now. He clutched his clipboard tighter and took a step back. "I do not have to show you anything. I am conducting official business, and I will not be questioned by civilians." Rachel pulled out her cell phone. "That is interesting, because I am going to call the police department right now to verify that you are who you claim to be. What agency did you say you work for?" Gary's face went pale. "You cannot do that. I am working undercover. Any calls to the police department could compromise my investigation." I almost laughed out loud. Gary was clearly making things up as he went along, and his story was getting more ridiculous by the minute. But Rachel maintained her professional demeanor. "Undercover officers still have to provide identification when requested by other law enforcement personnel," Rachel said calmly. "And since you seem to be having trouble with that, I am going to make a quick call to verify your status." Rachel dialed the number for the local police department. Gary watched her with growing panic in his eyes. He kept glancing at his fake patrol car as if he was thinking about making a run for it. "Yes, this is Officer Rachel Martinez with the County Police Department," Rachel said into her phone. "I am currently at 1247 Maple Street, and I have encountered someone claiming to be a law enforcement officer conducting HOA business. Can you tell me if you have any officers working in this area today?" There was a pause as Rachel listened to the response. The crowd of neighbors pressed closer, trying to hear what was being said. Gary was sweating profusely now, and his fake uniform was starting to look ridiculous rather than intimidating. "I see," Rachel said into the phone. "And do you have any officers working undercover HOA enforcement in this neighborhood?" "No. What about any other agencies? County, state, federal?" With each question, Gary looked more and more desperate. He was trapped, and he knew it. He had built his entire scam on the assumption that nobody would ever question his authority or call the real police to verify his story. "Thank you very much," Rachel said, ending the call. She turned to Gary with a smile that was both professional and dangerous. "Well, that was very interesting. The police department confirms that they have no officers working in this area today. They also confirm that they have no officers conducting HOA enforcement. In fact, they have never heard of any law enforcement agency that conducts HOA enforcement." Gary's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked at the crowd of neighbors who were now staring at him with a mixture of anger and disbelief. These were the same people he had been terrorizing for months, and now they were seeing him for what he really was. "There must be some mistake," Gary stammered. "I am working for a special task force. It is a joint operation between multiple agencies. They would not have information about it at the local level." Rachel shook her head. "Gary, I think we both know that is not true. I think we both know that you are not a law enforcement officer. I think we both know that you have been impersonating a police officer, which is a felony in this state." The crowd of neighbors was getting more excited now. Mrs. Henderson had come out of her house and was standing on her front porch, no longer hiding behind her curtains. Maria was recording everything on her phone. Other residents were talking among themselves, sharing stories of their encounters with Gary. Gary looked around desperately, realizing that his entire world was about to come crashing down. He had been running this scam for months, collecting money from vulnerable residents, intimidating people with fake authority, and enjoying the power he had over others. But now, in front of everyone he had victimized, his lies were being exposed. "I want to see what you have in that patrol car," Rachel said, walking toward Gary's vehicle. "I want to see your equipment, your documentation, and anything else that you claim gives you authority in this neighborhood." Gary rushed to block her path. "You cannot search my vehicle. That requires a warrant." Rachel smiled. "Gary, I am not searching your vehicle. I am simply asking you to show me the same documentation that any legitimate police officer would be happy to provide. Unless, of course, you have something to hide." Gary was completely cornered now, and everyone could see it. His fake uniform was soaked with sweat, his hands were shaking, and his voice was cracking with desperation. The crowd of neighbors had grown to include nearly everyone on the street, and they were all watching his performance fall apart in real time. "I need to make a phone call," Gary said, pulling out his cell phone. "I need to contact my supervisor to get authorization for this unusual situation." Rachel crossed her arms and waited. "Go ahead, Gary, call your supervisor. I would love to speak with them." Gary dialed a number and put the phone to his ear. We could all hear him talking, but it was obvious that he was not actually speaking to anyone. He was having a fake conversation with nobody, trying to buy time to figure out how to escape from this situation. "Yes, sir," Gary said into the phone. "I have a situation here with some civilians who are refusing to cooperate with my investigation. Yes, sir. I understand. Yes, sir." After a few minutes of this ridiculous performance, Gary hung up the phone and looked at Rachel with what he probably thought was renewed authority. "My supervisor says that I am authorized to continue my investigation without interference. He also says that anyone who obstructs my duties will be arrested and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Rachel held out her hand. "Gary, I would like to speak with your supervisor myself. Can you call him back and put him on speaker phone?" Gary's face went white. I cannot do that. He is in a meeting now. He is not available for civilian questions." That was when Mrs. Henderson stepped forward from the crowd. This elderly woman who had been terrorized by Gary for months was finally finding her voice. "You told me I owed $300 in fines for putting my trash cans out too early," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You said if I did not pay, you would have me arrested. You made me so scared that I gave you my grocery money." Maria stepped forward next. "You told me my children could not play in my own front yard. You said their toys were a violation of HOA rules. You made me pay $50 for a permit to park in my own driveway." Other neighbors began sharing their stories. Gary had been collecting money from people all over the neighborhood, using his fake authority to intimidate them into paying bogus fines and fees. The total amount he had stolen was probably in the thousands of dollars. Gary looked around at all the faces of people he had victimized. For the first time, he seemed to realize the full scope of what he had done. These were not just random people he had scammed. These were his neighbors, people who lived in the same community as him, people whose lives he had made miserable for his own profit. "You all need to calm down," Gary said, his voice getting higher and more desperate. "I am a law enforcement officer. I was just doing my job. I was enforcing the rules that everyone agreed to when they moved into this neighborhood." Rachel stepped forward. "Gary, I think it is time for you to stop lying. You are not a law enforcement officer. You do not work for any HOA. You do not have any authority to issue citations or collect fines. What you have been doing is called fraud, and it is a serious crime." Gary's fake authority finally cracked completely. "You do not know what you are talking about. I have been protecting this neighborhood. I have been keeping property values up. I have been making sure that people follow the rules." "What rules?" Rachel asked. "Show me the HOA documents that give you this authority. Show me the contracts that residents signed agreeing to these fines. Show me any legitimate documentation that supports what you have been doing." Gary could not produce any of these things because they did not exist. He had been making up rules as he went along, creating fake violations to justify collecting money from people who were too scared to question his authority. The crowd was getting more agitated now. People were sharing stories of how Gary had affected their lives, how he had stressed them out, how he had taken money they could not afford to lose. The anger was building, and Gary could feel it. "I think I should go now," Gary said, backing toward his fake patrol car. "I have other neighborhoods to check on. I will come back later to finish my investigation here." Rachel blocked his path. "Gary, I do not think you are going anywhere. In fact, I think you are going to stay right here until the real police arrive to sort this out." Gary looked around desperately. He was surrounded by angry neighbors, trapped by someone who knew he was a fraud, and facing the possibility of serious criminal charges. His months of terrorizing innocent people were about to catch up with him in a very real way. "I am a police officer," he said one more time, but his voice was barely a whisper now. "I am a police officer." "No, Gary," Rachel said firmly. "You are not, and everyone here knows it." Rachel pulled out her phone again and dialed 911. "This is Officer Rachel Martinez with the County Police Department. I am at 1247 Maple Street, and I need units to respond for someone impersonating a police officer. The suspect is on scene and attempting to flee." Gary's eyes went wide with panic. The reality of his situation was finally hitting him. He was not just going to be embarrassed in front of the neighbors he had been terrorizing. He was going to be arrested for serious criminal charges. "You cannot do this," Gary said, his voice cracking. "I have rights. I have not done anything wrong. I was just trying to help the neighborhood." Rachel kept her phone on speaker so everyone could hear the 911 operator. "Units are being dispatched to your location. Please maintain visual contact with the suspect and do not allow him to leave the scene." Gary looked around desperately. He was completely surrounded by neighbors who were no longer afraid of him. Mrs. Henderson was standing with her arms crossed, glaring at him with the fury of someone who had been cheated out of her grocery money. Maria was still recording everything on her phone, making sure there would be evidence of his breakdown. "I am going to my car," Gary announced, trying to sound official one last time. "I have paperwork to complete." Rachel stepped in front of him. "Gary, you are not going anywhere. The police are on their way and you are going to wait right here for them." Gary tried to push past her, but Rachel was trained in law enforcement techniques. She easily blocked his path without using any force. Gary was not a physical threat, just a desperate man who was finally facing consequences for his actions. "Get out of my way," Gary demanded. "I am a law enforcement officer and I order you to step aside." "Gary, stop," Rachel said calmly. "You are making this worse for yourself. The best thing you can do right now is cooperate and wait for the police to arrive." Within minutes, we could hear the sirens approaching. 2 patrol cars turned onto our street, their red and blue lights flashing. The real police officers who got out of those cars looked nothing like Gary. They were professional, calm, and clearly legitimate. The first officer approached Rachel. "Officer Martinez, I am Sergeant Johnson. We received your call about someone impersonating a police officer." Rachel showed her badge and explained the situation. She told Sergeant Johnson about Gary's fake uniform, his fake patrol car, and his months-long scam of collecting money from residents under false pretenses. Gary tried one last desperate attempt to maintain his charade. "Officers, thank goodness you are here. I have been trying to conduct an official investigation, but these people have been interfering with my duties." Sergeant Johnson looked at Gary with the trained eye of someone who had seen every type of criminal and con artist. "Sir, I am going to need to see your badge, your identification, and any documentation that proves you have law enforcement authority." Gary's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He could not produce these things because they did not exist. His cheap fake badge and his made-up authority were useless against real police officers who knew exactly what to look for. "Sir, please turn around and place your hands behind your back," Sergeant Johnson said. "You are under arrest for impersonating a police officer." The crowd of neighbors erupted in cheers and applause as the handcuffs clicked around Gary's wrists. Mrs. Henderson was crying with relief. Maria was hugging her children. Other residents were high-fiving each other and sharing their joy at finally seeing justice done. "You have the right to remain silent," Sergeant Johnson continued. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Gary was sobbing now. The fake authority figure who had terrorized our neighborhood for months was crying like a child as he was being arrested in front of everyone he had victimized. His fake uniform looked ridiculous. His fake patrol car was about to be towed as evidence, and his fake power was gone forever. The second police officer was examining Gary's fake patrol car. "Sergeant, you need to see this. This vehicle is equipped with illegal police equipment. He has fake emergency lights, fake sirens, and what appears to be forged police department decals. Sergeant Johnson nodded. That is additional charges. We are looking at impersonating a police officer, fraud, extortion, and illegal use of emergency equipment. This guy is going to prison for a long time. As Gary was loaded into the back of the real police car, neighbors continued to come forward with their stories. The officers took statements from Mrs. Henderson about the money she had paid, from Maria about the fake citations she had received, and from other residents about months of harassment and intimidation. Rachel stood beside me, watching as Gary was driven away in handcuffs. David, that man is going to face serious consequences for what he has done. Impersonating a police officer is a felony. Combined with the fraud and extortion charges, he could be looking at several years in prison. I looked around at my neighbors, who were finally free from Gary's fake authority. They were talking and laughing, sharing their relief at seeing him arrested. The fear that had hung over our neighborhood for months was finally gone. "Thank you," I said to Rachel. "If you had not been here today, he would still be out there terrorizing people." Rachel smiled. "That is what real police officers do, David. We protect people from criminals like Gary. And trust me, he is never going to hurt anyone in this neighborhood again." Over the next few days, the full scope of Gary's criminal operation became clear. Detective Williams from the Fraud Division contacted me and several other residents to gather evidence for the prosecution. What we discovered was far worse than any of us had imagined. Gary had been running his fake HOA enforcement scam for over 8 months. He had targeted more than 30 households in our neighborhood alone, collecting thousands of dollars in bogus fines and fees. His victims included elderly residents like Mrs. Henderson, single mothers like Maria, and even some young couples who were intimidated by his fake authority. Detective Williams explained that Gary had been very systematic in his approach. He would research neighborhoods that had real HOA organizations, then show up claiming to be a special enforcement officer. He carried fake credentials, drove a car that looked like a police vehicle, and wore a uniform that was designed to intimidate people into compliance. The psychological impact of this kind of fraud is often worse than the financial impact, Detective Williams told me during our interview. People feel violated when someone they trusted with authority betrays that trust. Your neighbors have been living in fear for months because of this man. The detective was right. As I talked to my neighbors in the days following Gary's arrest, I learned just how much his fake authority had affected their daily lives. Mrs. Henderson had been afraid to put her trash cans out at the normal time. Maria had stopped letting her children play in the front yard. Other residents had been avoiding activities they enjoyed because they were afraid of triggering one of Gary's fake violations. The most disturbing discovery was that Gary had been collecting personal information from residents under the guise of updating HOA records. He had copies of driver's licenses, social security numbers, and other sensitive documents that he could have used for identity theft or other crimes. He was not just running a simple scam, Detective Williams explained. He was building a database of personal information that could have been used for much more serious crimes. We are still investigating whether he sold this information to other criminals. The real HOA board was horrified when they learned what had been happening. The board president, Mrs. Chen, called an emergency meeting to address the situation and reassure residents that Gary had never been affiliated with the legitimate HOA in any way. "We want everyone to know that the HOA has never hired any enforcement officers," Mrs. Chen announced at the meeting. "We have never authorized anyone to collect fines or fees door to door. Any legitimate HOA business is conducted through official written notices and board meetings. The board also announced that they would be implementing new security measures to prevent similar scams in the future. They would be sending out identification cards to all residents with photos of legitimate board members, and they would be working with the police department to educate residents about how to verify the identity of anyone claiming to represent the HOA. Rachel stayed in touch with the investigation as it progressed. As a law enforcement officer, she was fascinated by the psychology of Gary's crimes and the impact they had on the community. What Gary did was not just about money, she explained to me one evening over dinner. He was getting a psychological thrill from having power over people. He enjoyed intimidating them, making them afraid, controlling their behavior. That is what made him so dangerous. The investigation also revealed that our neighborhood was not Gary's first target. He had been running similar scams in other communities for over 2 years. Police departments in 3 different counties were building cases against him for fraud, impersonation, and extortion. He has been living off this scam for years, Detective Williams told me. He would work a neighborhood until people started getting suspicious, then move on to a new area. He had fake credentials for multiple fake agencies, different uniforms, and even different vehicles depending on what type of authority he was claiming to have. The most satisfying part of the aftermath was seeing how the community came together to support Gary's victims. Mrs. Henderson was struggling financially after paying Gary's fake fines, so several neighbors organized a fundraiser to help her recover the money she had lost. Maria received donations to replace the toys that Gary had forced her to remove from her yard. The neighborhood also organized a block party to celebrate Gary's arrest and to strengthen the bonds between residents. For the first time in months, people felt safe gathering in public spaces without fear of being harassed by fake authority. This experience has taught all of us an important lesson, Mrs. Chen said at the block party. We learned that we need to question authority when something does not feel right. We learned that we need to support each other when someone is being bullied or intimidated. And we learned that real communities are stronger than fake authority. As I looked around at my neighbors laughing and enjoying themselves, I realized that Gary's arrest had done more than just remove a criminal from our streets. It had brought our community together in a way that had never happened before. We were no longer just people who happened to live near each other. We were neighbors who had survived something together and emerged stronger. 3 months after Gary's arrest, I received a call from the district attorney's office. Gary had been formally charged with 12 felony counts, including impersonating a police officer, fraud, extortion, and identity theft. The prosecutor, Ms. Roberts, wanted to meet with me and other victims to discuss the case. Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that we are taking this case very seriously, Ms. Roberts said during our meeting. Gary's crimes affected dozens of people across multiple communities. He stole thousands of dollars from hardworking families, and he caused psychological trauma that will take years to heal. Gary had tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The fake police equipment in his car, the forged documents, the recorded testimonies from his victims, and the financial records showing his illegal income all painted a clear picture of a systematic criminal operation. He is looking at a minimum of 5 years in prison, Ms. Roberts explained. But given the number of victims and the sophisticated nature of his crimes, he could face up to 15 years. We are also pursuing full restitution for all of his victims. The trial was scheduled for 6 months later, but Gary's lawyer advised him to accept a plea deal rather than face a jury. In the end, Gary was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to all of his victims. His fake patrol car and equipment were destroyed, and he was banned from owning any vehicle or equipment that could be used to impersonate law enforcement. Rachel attended the sentencing hearing with me. Seeing Gary in an orange jumpsuit instead of his fake uniform was a powerful reminder of how completely his fake authority had been stripped away. "Your Honor," Gary said during his statement to the court, "I want to apologize to all of the people I hurt. I know that what I did was wrong, and I am ready to accept the consequences of my actions." But his apology felt hollow. Throughout the entire legal process, Gary had tried to minimize his crimes and shift blame to others. He claimed that he had been trying to help neighborhoods maintain their property values. He insisted that he had never meant to hurt anyone. He portrayed himself as a misguided community volunteer rather than a calculating criminal. The judge saw through his excuses. "Mr. Gary, you systematically targeted vulnerable people in their own homes. You used fake authority to intimidate them into giving you money they could not afford to lose. You caused psychological trauma that will affect your victims for years to come. This was not a misguided attempt to help your community. This was a calculated criminal enterprise designed to exploit people's trust in law enforcement." After the sentencing, I met with Mrs. Henderson and Maria outside the courthouse. Both women had received full restitution for the money Gary had stolen from them, but the psychological impact of his crimes would take longer to heal. "I still get nervous when I see police cars," Mrs. Henderson admitted. "Even though I know the officers are legitimate, Gary's fake authority made me afraid of anyone in a uniform." Maria nodded. "My children ask me why the bad man dressed like a police officer. It is hard to explain to them that most police officers are good people who protect us, but some people pretend to be police officers to hurt others." These conversations reminded me that Gary's crimes had damaged more than just people's bank accounts. He had undermined trust in legitimate authority and made people afraid in their own neighborhoods. The full healing process would take time and community support. But there were also positive outcomes from this experience. Our neighborhood had become much more connected and supportive. We had learned to question authority when something seemed wrong, and we had learned to support each other when someone was being targeted by bullies or scammers. Rachel's quick thinking and professional expertise had been the key to exposing Gary's crimes. Without her law enforcement background, Gary might have continued his scam for months or even years longer. Her courage in confronting him had given everyone else the confidence to speak up about their own experiences. "This case shows why it is so important for communities to work together," Rachel told me. "Criminals like Gary count on people being isolated and afraid. When neighbors support each other and share information, it becomes much harder for scammers to operate." The experience also taught me about the importance of standing up to bullies, even when they claim to have authority. Gary's fake power had seemed so real because nobody had ever challenged it. But when someone finally questioned his credentials and demanded proof of his authority, his entire facade collapsed immediately. 6 months after Gary's sentencing, our neighborhood organized another block party. This time, we invited representatives from the real police department and the legitimate HOA board to meet with residents and answer questions about how to verify authority and protect against scams. The best defense against people like Gary is education and community support. Officer Martinez from our local police department explained to the gathered crowd. "Real law enforcement officers will always be happy to show their credentials and explain their authority. Anyone who refuses to provide identification or gets angry when questioned is probably not legitimate. The police department also distributed flyers with information about how to verify law enforcement credentials and what to do if someone suspected they were dealing with an impersonator. They provided phone numbers for reporting suspicious activity and encouraged residents to call immediately if they encountered anyone claiming to be a police officer who seemed suspicious. As I stood in my front yard, watching my neighbors enjoy themselves without fear of harassment, I reflected on how much had changed since that Saturday afternoon when Gary had blocked my driveway. What had started as a simple confrontation had exposed a criminal operation that had been terrorizing multiple communities for years. Gary's fake authority had seemed so real because he had understood how to exploit people's natural respect for law enforcement. He had used official-looking uniforms, vehicles, and equipment to create an illusion of legitimacy that most people never thought to question. But when someone with real law enforcement experience had challenged his authority, the illusion had crumbled immediately. The most important lesson from this experience was that real authority welcomes questions and scrutiny. Legitimate police officers, HOA representatives, and other officials are always willing to provide credentials and explain their authority. Anyone who gets defensive or angry when asked for identification is probably trying to hide something. I also learned that communities are stronger when people support each other against bullies and scammers. Gary had been able to operate for so long because his victims had been isolated and afraid. But when neighbors came together to share their experiences and support each other, his power had evaporated. Rachel had become something of a local hero for her role in exposing Gary's crimes. The police department had even asked her to speak at community events about how to identify and report police impersonators. Her expertise and courage had protected not just our neighborhood, but potentially dozens of other communities where Gary might have operated in the future. "David, you should be proud of yourself too," Rachel told me as we watched the block party from my front porch. "You could have just paid Gary's fake fines and tried to avoid confrontation. Instead, you stood up to him and gave me the opportunity to expose his crimes. Sometimes it takes just one person refusing to be bullied to protect an entire community." As the sun set on our neighborhood block party, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Gary's reign of terror was over. His victims had received justice and restitution. The community had learned valuable lessons about protecting against scams and supporting each other. And most importantly, the fear that had hung over our neighborhood for months was finally gone. The fake HOA cop who had blocked my driveway and threatened to arrest me was now serving 8 years in prison. His fake uniform had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit. His fake authority had been replaced with real consequences, and his fake power had been replaced with genuine community strength. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it is worth the wait. Gary had learned the hard way that fake authority is no match for real law enforcement, genuine community support, and the courage of people who refuse to be bullied. His tears as he was handcuffed in front of the crowd he had terrorized would remain one of the most satisfying moments of my life. The neighborhood was finally safe again, and we were all stronger for having faced this challenge together.